welcome everybody to the webinar. Thanks for participating today. This is Nathan Lee. I'm one of the partners here at Richey May and one of the leaders of the mortgage banking practice. I also have the honor of leading our technology practice and our technology team here at the firm. And we have one of the members of that team, one of the leaders of our technology practice, doing this webinar for us today. So we're excited to have him participate, and I'll introduce him here in a minute. Just wanted to let you know just a couple of housekeeping items here as we get started. We'll reserve some time at the end of the presentation for questions or comments. Throughout the webinar, you can use the question feature there on the sidebar of your webinar app, and you can submit those questions. And at the end of the presentation here, we'll take some time to go through some of those. If we don't get a chance to go through all of them, we'll follow up individually with those that submit some questions. And then we'll then also at the end of the webinar or here at some point in the next day or two, we'll have the recording and the slides made available to participants, and also any that are not able to sit in through the entire webinar today. So with that, I'll introduce our presenter, is JT Gallardo. He is the leader of our cybersecurity practice here at the firm, and he is an executive director in our technology practice here at Richey May. He has a tremendous amount of experience in the cybersecurity area. He spent the better part of 18 or 20 years focused on cybersecurity, and has built cybersecurity programs for a couple large organizations, and has been here at the firm for a couple of years, leading our cybersecurity practice and doing a lot of cybersecurity advisory work for our mortgage company clients throughout the country. So with that, I'll turn the time over to JT, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Nathan. First and foremost, thanks everybody for joining today. We're going to go over our 2019 trends in cybersecurity and technology. And as part of this, again, I want to encourage everybody to submit any questions that they may have as we go through the presentation. There's a lot of content, and there can be some questions, so please feel free to make this as interactive as possible. So a little more housekeeping real quick for those of you on the line. Richey May Technology Solutions is part of Richey May, and our overall focus is to provide results-driven consulting for all of our mortgage banking clients in a variety of capacities, including cybersecurity, cloud, government risk and compliance, and business intelligence. That's a great picture of me smiling. So for those of you that can't picture my face on the webinar today, and so moving on, the question comes up quite often is, what is cybersecurity? And too frequently do we fall into the rut of finding out that technology seems to be the point of peace, but it really is the combination of people, technology, and process working together to protect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data within your business. And one of the reasons this seems so difficult to prevent attacks and be successful overall is that we have to be right as defenders 100% of the time, and the bad guys only have to be right once. And that is a story and a tale that we're going to talk about throughout the presentation when we talk about trends for this year. One of the trend reports that we follow very closely is the Verizon Data Breach Report. And for many years, financial services has been either the first or second most attacked industry by volume. 2018, we actually saw a decrease in this, and then financial services is now the third highest number attacked industry, with the public sector taking the first position. But within that 8% of all the attacks that occurred last year, nearly 50% of them impacted small to mid-sized financial services companies. And the Ponyman Institute, based out of Michigan, estimates that the cost of remediation for every compromised customer record is approximately $150. And that's just to remediate. That's not the cost of civil liabilities or any other potential transactional fines that you may face or loss of production. This is literally just the cost to remediate the incident. Another study that recently was released by IBM's Security Research Group found that 60% of the costs from a data breach are actually incurred in the first year, but there's a long 3-year plus curve of additional costs from both remediation, but it could be civil penalties or additional costs due to additional examinations and things that you may face from state and federal regulators due to the incident that you have. One of the interesting statistics there is that the overall average cost of a data breach in 2018 was estimated at $3.9 million. And while that number seems pretty high, there's other incidents that have occurred this year with other lenders in this space that would echo that number is not too far off base. Another group that also has provided some very pertinent feedback on what's going on in the industry is the FBI Internet Crime Complaint Center. They track both business and consumer-related financial losses related to cyber, and they actually provide mortgage banking and real estate-specific statistics. And they found that in 2018, there was a little over 11,000 victims of wire fraud that led to a loss of $150 million. And many of the lenders that we talk to all can relate to the phishing emails and the other miscellaneous fraud attempts that are occurring throughout the loan origination process. And what I think was the most telling statistic there is that the numbers in 2018 were nearly a 3x increase from what was happening in 2017. And what that tells me, and should tell us as a whole within the within every organization, is that as an industry in mortgage banking, the bad guys are waking up that there is a mortgage banking industry and that there's a lot of money in the mortgage banking industry. And so I think that's a telling position as we move forward and look at these statistics that we're going to only see continued increase. The other interesting statistic that the FBI provides is a state map based on the number of victims. And I think when you look at this and you look at where a lot of the major markets are for mortgage bank lending, this really shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. With New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia on the East Coast, Georgia and Florida in the Southeast, Illinois and Chicago making up kind of that Midwest region, Washington and California on the West Coast, and then of course Texas, which is on of itself a very large market. The United States Council of Economic Advisors also found, and their report stems from 2017. They looked at statistics that occurred in 2016 that the U.S. economy as a whole loses anywhere from $57 to $109 billion due to malicious cyber activity. And I would think that when they release the report here in 2020, which is when their next release is going to come out, I think these numbers are going to be even higher, maybe even double. And really the point of the statistic, and the reason I like to bring this up, is that as many of you know, we rely on many different organizations across that origination food chain. And you can have a very tight cybersecurity program, but you're only as strong as everybody else within your vendor mix. And so, really we have to come to a conclusion that cybersecurity is a common good for everybody, and that one organization that has lax cybersecurity practices actually poses a significant risk, not just to the overall industry, but the overall economy. And that includes, title companies and other smaller organizations that, handle consumer data and are part of that origination process. Another interesting statistic is that, ESG research reached out to 400 mid-market companies around how they handled with cybersecurity and how incidents impacted them. And nearly half of them said that they had a security incident the past year, and 65% of those companies had not only had an incident over the past year, but nearly 30 of them was due to an adoption of a new technology that they didn't fully understand. I think that's a great highlight to the recent breach that came out from Capital One, where not only did they have a threat actor that was working inside of Amazon, but some of the configuration controls they had over their cloud platform weren't sufficient to protect the organization. And a recent article that just came out over the weekend found that several of their internal IT folks had questions around how those systems were actually configured. So where are these attacks really coming from? And one of the biggest pieces is the human element. Our technology has gotten extremely sophisticated over time, but the bad guys are really trying to leverage things like fraudulent email, social media, and other digital communication channels to defraud you of funds, or use that as a starting point to form a larger attack on your organization. But far more than any other attack vector, phishing was the most common initial point of compromise for companies in 2018 in the financial services sector. When you start looking at the numbers, it's quite staggering. These statistics look at different types of cybercrime. The one that I think is worth pointing out here is that when you look at how many ransomware campaigns are conducted on a daily basis. And so if you think of it a campaign similar to how we do a marketing campaign today and we target potential borrowers, we take a collection of contacts that we have, we work with our marketing teams, and we send out a marketing campaign either through email or some other form of digital or physical media. No different than what the threat actors are doing. They're taking a pool of potential targets and they're creating a campaign to target those. And so on a daily basis, there's 4,000 different ransomware type campaigns being conducted on a daily basis. And so when you think about just that one piece alone, the fact that we have to be right as organizations 100% of the time, it's an uphill battle, because that ransomware attack just needs one user to click on an email or a website link to start things in motion. So how are we attacking these things? And one of the things that literally just was shared with me this morning through one of my MBA contacts is a response to the Capital One incident. And so on the Hill, there's going to be continued focus, and I encourage everyone on this call and everyone else that listens to this webinar as a recording to spend a lot of attention on what's going to come out of Washington in the coming months in relation to additional regulation. Because of the size of Capital One and the size of Amazon, there's a lot of rigor being discussed around how we're going to treat cloud computing and how financial services companies are going to have to add additional due diligence to their vendor management programs when they're leveraging cloud platforms. Not just Amazon, but that includes things like Ellie Mae or Box.com or any of the other SaaS and cloud-based applications that you use across your organization. And so that's a trend that literally is fresh off the press this morning, but something that I encourage everyone to pay attention to. But one area, and this is an acronym that we should all know in this industry, is GLBA. It's been around for a very long time, and one of the areas that I like to highlight is the safeguard rule. And underneath the safeguard rule, the law actually says organizations have to take reasonable steps to ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of consumers' non-public financial information. And over time, what was deemed reasonable has changed, right? And in 2018, New York really raised the bar with what was considered a reasonable safeguard. And so today, even if you're not licensed in the state of New York, the reasonable safeguard that you should be following is that you're encrypting your consumer data both in transit and at rest. So that includes encryption on your mobile devices, that includes encryption on laptops, the use of multi-factor authentication at the very least for all remote access into your environment. Even more so, we're encouraging organizations to really look at multi-factor across the board, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Have consistent patch management on all devices. This is a biggie. Still in 2019, patching is one of the most effective risk mitigation and threat protection mechanisms that we have, and a lot of organizations still struggle with that. And again, we'll talk about that later. Consider leveraging an endpoint security tool such as an EDR or a next generation antivirus software. I think most organizations have antivirus today, but really taking it up that next level so you can look at the behavior that's actually occurring in your environment versus signature-based security tools. And then having an annual risk assessment, really understand where is your data stored, where are your risks to not just your consumer data, but across your organization. If certain things were to happen, how would that impact your ability to originate and underwrite loans? As I mentioned before, this is one that we should all be familiar with, and it is in full effect as of 2019, which is the New York State Department of Financial Services law, also known as the NYDFS NYCRR.500. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but that's a law that was put on the books to have organizations, mainly financial services companies that are licensed in the state of New York with $5 million or more in revenue, to have specific security controls in place. And as we talk about some of these regulations, I think you're going to see a theme. The first being multi-factor authentication for, again, all remote access. So that's if you've got individuals working from home that use VPN or accessing different cloud tools to get to consumer data, you should have multi-factor in place. Again, encryption on all your devices. This one is the one that I just mentioned earlier with what we're seeing as a blowback from Cap 1 is comprehensive vendor risk management. And a lot of organizations struggle with onboarding different softwares and service providers into the environment, especially in a decentralized model. You might have multiple branches. A branch manager might reach out to a vendor and just pay by credit card and expense it. And so that's one way that organizations have vendors come on board that don't go through the traditional risk management process. That's an area that you really need to focus. Have a semi-annual vulnerability assessment. So that means that you're scanning your environment to make sure that your configurations and patches are where they need to be at least every 6 months, and have an annual penetration test. That's where you hire a third-party firm to come in and attempt to hack your organization, similar to what a threat actor would do, and see how far they can get and what kind of information they get access to. One of the very unique things about NYDFS is that they require companies to have a named Chief Information Security Officer. And again, that person could be either internalized or a third party, but the big piece is they have to be qualified. So if an individual isn't classically trained or has some formal cybersecurity credentials, this is one that I've seen NYDFS push back on in audits over the last 6 months. We've also seen a number of other states come on board. Arizona came on with expanding their data breach notification and cybersecurity law to include civil penalties. Late last year, Colorado also passed and expanded privacy and cybersecurity legislation for companies operating in Colorado or impacting consumers in the state. And this is one that in both of those cases, organizations are being forced to create formal cybersecurity programs that aren't just, hey, we have a cyber program. It has to actually be focused on protecting the information that you have based on the size and complexity of that data and your interactions with the consumer. So if you're a smaller company, the expectation isn't that you're going to have the same protections that a money center bank like Capital One has, but you have controls in place that meet the size and complexity of your organization. Another one that came online late last year was also the state of Ohio. And this one's actually a little bit more unique in that not only do you have to have a written cybersecurity program, but they go a step further, providing civil safe harbor to organizations that have adopted formal frameworks. So if you've built your program around the NIST standard, ISO, or PCI, even if you don't collect cardholder data, the state of Ohio recognizes that, hey, we get that cybersecurity incidents happen, but if you're taking the due diligence steps by aligning yourself with a specific framework, we're going to create a safe harbor for you outside of civil penalties. It doesn't mean that the attorneys general won't still come and find fines that way, but it does protect you from those civil lawsuits from consumers. Pardon me. The next big one that I think is probably in the forefront of everybody because there's been a lot of news and press around this recently is the California Consumer Privacy Act, or the CCPA. This was passed unanimously in the California State Assembly, and it's essentially the European Union's GDPR law, except tailored for California residents. And it provides some very specific things starting January of next year for California consumers and how they handle their data privacy. The first being that it outlines specific things of what they consider non-public information. And that's not just the traditional financial sense of like social security number, credit history, things of that nature. But they also rope things in like biometric data, because more and more organizations are using biometrics for authentication. It also counts social media connections. So if you think about how your marketing teams work from a top of funnel perspective and how you target potential customers, that data is in scope. The demographic information that fits into that is in scope, as well as email addresses. And so this is going to be a challenge for many lenders who have a good understanding of where their financial services data is, but may struggle to understand what the marketing team is doing and what all that information they're collecting, where it's stored, and how it's handled. And the reason that becomes important is that the CCPA enables consumers that have the right to be forgotten, meaning that if your revenues are of a certain size, if either you have 25 million or 50,000 more customers or consumer records, you're in scope of this. And you have to take reasonable precautions, again, to protect the consumer data. And I would use the state of New York as that baseline of what's deemed reasonable. You have to provide your consumers two methods to contact you that have the right to be forgotten. That doesn't mean that you have to delete all their financial data, because under the CCPA, there's a carve out for federal mandated data that's retained, but you do have to let the consumers know what data you have about them, and let them know what data that you're able to purge from your system that you're not legally required to retain. And so that does require you to create a good data map of your environment, of what you have and where you're storing it. And then when they ask for that information to be forgotten, you have to purge that data from your system. And that includes your backups, which can be very tricky. And so that is something that you need to be aware of. And the last one is you can't charge an additional fee for a service if the consumer decides to opt out. From a mortgage banking perspective, this shouldn't be a big deal. This part of the law is really in there for service providers like Facebook or Gmail, who derive their business off of using consumer data for marketing purposes. If the consumer decides to opt out of that process, they can't be charged additional fees for the service, even if they don't want their data used for advertising. So that's really what that clause in the law is for. The next trend that we're seeing, excuse me, is monetized attacks. And so this really shouldn't be a shock to anybody, especially with a lot of the news we've seen around ransomware. But in 2018, we saw a massive increase in email fraud focused on phishing and wire fraud. In 2017 into 2018, the trend was actually looking more at crypto mining because of the prices for Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies was quite high. But as those different funds actually devalued, we saw the threat actors move back to some more traditional monetizing attacks, such as using phishing and wire fraud to get escrow funds and things of that nature. And then we're seeing an uptick, and we've seen this in the news, both for lenders but also regional governments. In the state of Texas, there was 23, I think, municipalities just targeted. over the last several days, but ransomware is becoming the new social norm, if you will, in this space. And it does start with the traditional phishing campaign. Some of them, like I said, it's a shotgun approach. They take a big list, they send the content out, and they see who clicks, and hopefully they get some takers, and they go from there. But more often than not, we're starting to see more spear phishing. And this is where they're taking information off of sites like LinkedIn, or in some cases, companies that publish their entire corporate directory on their primary website. They're taking that and finding specific individuals within that firm and targeting them for these attacks. In the fourth quarter of 2018, there was an actual massive uptick in fraud emails that have embedded URLs in them to convince users to click, nearly an 85% increase. And that's because we're getting better at looking at the bodies of email and understanding if it looks like a fraudulent phish email or not. And so now their goal is to try to get you to follow a web link to go to a website that looks like the destination that they're intending. And in addition to that, right, there was a 30% increase in email fraud overall using compromised legitimate accounts. And this is where the bad guys are taking over your G Suite or your Office 365 account, and they're looking at all your sent items, and then they're targeting different business connections that you have to drive their attack further. As I mentioned briefly earlier, is that in 2019, though, we're seeing a massive increase in ransomware. And some of the chilling statistics that come out of that is 75% of companies infected with ransomware had up-to-date endpoint protection in their antivirus. It just was not detected by the traditional AV. Nearly 30% of those companies, it took them a week or longer to actually regain access to their data, and that was either due to them deciding not to pay the ransom and restoring from backup, or paying the ransom and then trying to unencrypt the data. In both cases, they were down for a significant amount of time. Year to date, in 2019, compared to numbers that we were seeing in 2017, we've had a 109% increase, which is drastic, right? As I mentioned before, as we've seen the ability to monetize different types of attacks, the threat actors are changing their strategies on how they monetize and leverage their platforms essentially to make money. And as many of us know on this call, a reasonably sized mortgage company recently paid a $1.6 million ransom that they publicly disclosed. And that's just the ransom itself. That doesn't take into account the cost of remediation and fixing that environment. So when we start talking about that $3.9 million earlier in the presentation, that's where we draw a lot of our parallels that cleaning up from these types of incidents are exceedingly expensive. Again, phishing is still the initial way for compromise. They're looking to do a lot of different things through phishing. It's not just getting malicious code and backdoors installed in your environment. They're also looking to steal your username and passwords. And so for companies that aren't using MFA, that really makes it an easy target. The most common attachment that we're seeing come through in the financial services side is a weaponized Word document. And so if you think about how frequently we're sending Word documents around just as the course of business in Excel spreadsheets, right? This is a real easy one for people just to jump on and click on without thinking. Once a computer is compromised, the threat actors really take their time to gather information about the organization they've just gained access to, and they really work on a strategy on how they're going to monetize their outcome. And so, even a year or even 2 years back, you saw a lot of ransomware incidents that were flat fees. Hey, we've got your data, pay us $6,000, we're going to go away. What we're seeing now is they gain access and a foothold in an environment, and they do a footprint of the organization to really try to match the ransom based on the size and complexity and what they think you're going to pay. And so that is the chilling piece, is that you may have been compromised for a number of days or weeks before you actually get the ransom request. And at which point they know what your financial status is and your size is, and typically the ransom mirrors that. I'll touch on this lightly, but as I mentioned, business email compromise. 2018 we saw a 150% increase in cyber attacks targeting financial companies, where legitimate email accounts were used as part of the attack. Business email compromise is estimated to have led to nearly $12 billion in losses since we saw the first attack in 2013, with the average being about 130,000 or more. And so that's the typical, hey, accounts payable, I need you to change where you're wiring that money for this invoice to this place. Or, hey, borrower, we want your earnest funds to go to this routing number instead of this one. And so it always starts with identifying the target, and then moving forward, they try to groom the user, right? So they start looking through your sent items. They look at how you communicate with people. Some of the more sophisticated attacks that we've seen, they'll tailor the signature similar to how that individual the individual's account that had been compromised communicates with somebody. So, for instance, internal to my firm, most of everybody here knows that I sign my emails with just a dash and my initials. But when I send a more formal email out, I'll have my more formal commercial signature on it. The bad guys look at that, and they try to tailor those interactions with the people they're targeting in that same manner. Once they've done that, right, they exchange information with their victims. We've got a couple case studies we'll talk about how that part works. And then typically they're trying to get you to wire money, either not necessarily off seas, because offshore accounts are getting flagged more and more by banking institutions. Instead, they'll use an intermediary site such as Wells Fargo or Capital One, a larger money center bank, and then they'll move the funds from there offshore. And once those monies are moved, it's exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, to get the monies back. One of the interesting stories as of recent was Voya Financial. They recently settled with the SEC for not only violating the red flags rule, but also the safeguards rule. In 2016, they had threat actors that impersonated customers by calling their service center and requesting their password to be reset. And so the first fail of due protection there was that Voya wasn't actually validating their consumers' information when they were resetting the password appropriately. And this was proven out through a number of call recordings that were listened to. What they then did was the attackers then opened up additional fraudulent accounts using that victim's information, and over a 6-day period opened up almost 6,000 different accounts. And they used those accounts again for either funneling funds, illicit funds in and out of the country, or other malicious means. But again, through the red flags rule, that large spike of account openings should have been a red flag, as well as through the safeguards rule. They should have been taking additional due care for validating the consumers were who they said they were. So the first case study, and this is actual account from a client, they were experiencing an increase in wire fraud emails going out from email accounts of their key members of their executive leadership team. What we found was a member of the leadership team, so a C-level position in the company, had been using the same password for multiple accounts, both personally and professionally. And why this is important, and a question that we get asked all the time, is why does it matter that my LinkedIn account was compromised, or my Hulu account was compromised, or take your pick. And the reason why these breaches, or like the recent one with Marriott, why these breaches are really critical is that the bad guys amass all these usernames and passwords in very large databases. And they use those databases when they want to target an organization through a process called password stuffing. And that's how they're able to compromise corporate Office 365 or G Suite email accounts that don't use multi-factor, because people tend to reuse their passwords. And that's the danger there. And so what we found during the investigation is that that individual's Office 365 account had been compromised, and the attacker had been actively logging in, monitoring business transactions, and actively sending emails on behalf of that individual. And the tricky piece was that they were deleting the sent item. So there wasn't initially a tipping point to know that that email was coming from a legitimate account. So they're doing a pretty good job of cleaning up after themselves. But all of it was rooted in the fact that that executive leader was reusing their username and password. Another one was that we had a personal admin within a company receive an email appearing to come from a company executive, and the request was interesting, and in the fact that the threat actor was asking, again, appearing to be that company executive, asking for the admin to buy iTunes gift cards and then scratch off the code on the back and give it to them through text message. And while on the surface, again, when we look at this case study, you might scratch your head, but the interesting thing about this was the attack initially started as an email, and the personal admin responded to that email saying, kind of questioning the request, but she responded with her corporate signature. And in her corporate signature, her cell phone was in there. And so what the threat actor did, having fear that he or she was getting discovered, they quickly changed the conversation to that individual's cell phone and started texting that person. That put that admin's fears at ease, because initially the interaction coming to her cell phone, oh, this really must be the person I think it is because they have my cell phone number. And then when as the request seems kind of off the wall, hey, I need you to go to the Apple store and buy me some iTunes gift cards. She went ahead and did that. She's taking pictures of the cards and texted them out. And the reason they got tipped off on this was that she had to call the CFO and ask for an increase in her corporate credit card limit because she'd maxed it out. And so they lost a significant amount of money because she, as you can imagine, a personal admin for the executive team's got a pretty large corporate card limit. And so finally it was flagged, but that's when, the wake-up call happened. And of course, at that point, it's too late. So, how do we address some of these things? And our recommendations to everyone is that your employees are your first line of defense. And so, training and education is key. And while there's a lot of different technologies that you can layer on to help with this, employee education is really the first place that you should start. The next one is that you really need to update and test your incident response plan. Just having something sitting on the shelf isn't going to get it done. When you look at some of the most recent ransomware incidents that have occurred this year to lenders, this is the first topic that comes up every single time. We need to really focus and test on our incident response plan and work through different test scenarios that we've seen other companies go through, such as ransomware attacks, or inclement weather that closes your business, things of that nature, and really make sure that your plan can address different scenarios. The third is the adoption of a holistic email hygiene solution, and there's a number of the products out there from companies like Monetized, Proofpoint, and Microsoft, and this really helps cut and squelch some of the fraudulent and malicious attacks that you see coming in through email, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And again, multi-factor authentication for access into your Office 365, G Suite, or other remote access through VPN. That really cuts down on the ability for the bad guys to use your own users' accounts against you. And another one that we still see out there is turning on domain-based authentication services like DMARC and SPF records. This is a great way to cut down on emails that may go to your consumers that look like they come from you. And then again, we encourage folks to look at an advanced EDR or next-gen malware solution that looks at behavior, not necessarily definition-based detection. And the next big trend that we're seeing is around cloud adoption and cloud security. 2018, we talked about the forward growth going into the cloud space, and it didn't disappoint. Cloud and SaaS services generated nearly $70 billion in revenue last year, and that was a 15% growth over 2017. And we expect to see that growth continue through 2021, starting to level out around $117 billion. And what does that mean? So that really means that mortgage companies as a whole, your peers, are moving to the cloud. They're not moving just to the cloud for email or LOS, but we're now starting to see that movement for all the general IT systems. Companies moving their Active Directory to the cloud, their BI and database services, all that is starting to move, and that's just something to be aware of, especially with the recent news coming out of Capital One. And there are some general benefits when you look at moving to the cloud. It reduces your overall risk. It doesn't eliminate, but it does definitely reduce your risk associated with disaster recovery and business continuity. And part of that is because by design, when you move to a commercial cloud such as Amazon or Microsoft, your data is replicated across multiple data centers within a region. And that inherent resiliency adds a level of disaster recovery and business continuity that traditionally mortgage banking clients didn't have without having multiple data centers and having some pretty expensive and sophisticated configurations. Third-party vendor management is another big one, and I encourage everyone to pay attention to what our representatives in Washington are start looking at in this space, because inherently this could create a very large burden for the industry, depending on which direction they go for oversight, especially over cloud providers. And again, there was a shared responsibility with what happened with Capital One or any other data breach that you see coming out with the cloud that folks tend to forget about. You're responsible for making sure the environment's configured adequately based on your size, complexity, and who needs access. The cloud provider is responsible for doing the physical security elements. And I think that's lost in the translation when a lot of folks move to the cloud. And that's one piece that again, we encourage everyone to stay focused on and look at the contracts, look at what you're signing up for and what you're responsible for and what the provider's responsible for. Within that thought process, the traditional centralized security model, it doesn't really translate to the cloud. Your objects are distributed. You've got employees working from home. It's not as easy as it was 5 to 10 years ago when you had everybody in one or two physical locations and you were able to put them behind a firewall. This one I would highlight, bold, and underline multiple times. You really have to understand the product and how that product is configured to protect your environment and your consumers. It's very easy to move to the cloud and turn cloud services on. It's not very surprising to us when we talk to clients and we say, well, hey, you should turn this on and this on. They're like, well, how much more is that going to cost me? And we're like, it's not going to cost you anything else. Those features are actually there. So there's just a lot of things that come bundled today, especially with things like Microsoft Office 365 that you may not even be aware that you have that you should look at. Because the vendors are really putting together effective solutions to try to help customers reduce their risk and the overall threat for data breach and confidentiality issues. So we've talked about this quite a bit, right? We had the Capital One incident that just happened at the tail end of July. It impacted 106 million people, but a very small number of Social Security numbers, right? 140,000. But this is a unique incident because it partially fits into a traditional insider threat. Because not only was Capital One utilizing misconfigured storage containers within AWS, but the attacker was an Amazon employee. And so she was using her permissions and her elevated view to find misconfigured S3 buckets. And what was even worse is that then she took that data and she stuck it on GitHub to try to avoid getting caught. and so then she, essentially by putting it on GitHub, made Capital One's data and their associated consumers available for everyone to be downloaded. Capital One was actually tipped off by an anonymous person that found that data on GitHub, and once it was identified, they leveraged their incident response plan to quickly resolve the issue, and they were able to catch the individual. But again, it took a couple key things there of getting notified and being able to enact and respond in an effective manner before that data spread farther than it had. So, one of the things that I like to share with folks is that, there is really no destination. Cybersecurity is a continuous journey, and for two reasons. One, the threat actors and the bad guys continually evolve, but the way we work and interact with consumers continues to evolve. And those changes combined really mean that there'll never be an end to this, right? So how do we drive efficiencies and enhancements to make sure that we're able to take and reduce risk to an acceptable level, but do it in a cost-effective manner? So the first piece of that is we talk about cybersecurity insurance. And more this topic comes up within the mortgage banking industry. And Cisco actually did a great survey last year that found that 75% of companies still don't have cybersecurity insurance. And of those that they surveyed, nearly half of them were financial services companies. And of the folks that did have insurance, they were underinsured, meaning that they had a policy, but they didn't understand what that policy covered, what the structural limits were, or even more so, what steps they had to take during an incident to ensure they would have coverage underneath their plan. And that's a very key takeaway here, is that you may have insurance, but there may be clauses in that insurance policy that you have to contact the carrier at a certain point in your incident response plan so that you can get coverage. Waiting until the incident or breach is remediated, many times now the insurance carriers won't provide coverage for that. And most of that is because they have their own service providers they like to have you engage and things of that nature to make sure that they're containing their costs and risks. And so that's something that I encourage everybody to look at your policy today if you have one, and make sure that your incident response plan highlights that when you should contact your carrier. Also take in consideration how much data you have. I think many organizations fail to realize, especially organizations that have been in business for a very long time, how much data they've actually developed and built up over time. And this is another space where we see a significant amount of growth. We think that the industry as a whole is going to grow to nearly $14 billion by 2022. The next one that we like to talk about is SIM technology. Again, a lot of compliance and regulatory requirements ask organizations to install a SIM. And one of the things that we highlight here is that the initial first year cost just for the solutions anywhere between 50 and 60K, and that doesn't count your cost for staffing. And there are many other services that we would highly recommend that you look at, because a SIM on it in its own is only as effective as you care and feed for it. It's not one of those set and forget types of technology that reduces your risk, and it's a fairly costly expense to not get any value out of. The next one is just some general best practices and how you address some of these common vulnerabilities. And we've touched on several of these throughout. But again, make sure that you update and test your incident response plan. Again, in that same study I mentioned earlier from Cisco, nearly 3/4 of the companies surveyed hadn't updated their incident response or disaster recovery strategy. They had one, but they hadn't actually tested it or dusted it off in a while. And having that comprehensive plan, it has been found to dramatically reduce your downtime when you have to respond to a cybersecurity incident, such as a ransomware attack. One of the other things that we're seeing that we highly recommend folks do is contact your local FBI field office early in your response plan, especially if it's a ransomware incident. Because what the FBI is doing even though they may not persecute and go after the attacker, they're actually keeping a key repository on some of the very common ransomware variants that we're seeing out there. So you may be able to avoid paying any ransom at all because they may have the key to give to you. So we're encouraging folks to again, include the FBI early in your incident response strategy for ransomware. And again, don't forget to test that plan. Do a tabletop exercise and walk through it to understand where your weaknesses are. Again, we talked about EDR. As the workforce becomes increasingly distributed, people working from home, a lot of different branch offices, that traditional security model doesn't work as well. And EDR solutions look at the behavior on the endpoint device, not just the type of software that's coming and going. And many of these solutions have what they call ransomware canaries built in, where they have hidden files either on the local hard drive or on your server that will highlight and alert if they see them get encrypted, so that you can get in front of a ransomware attack before it's too late. And again, they don't necessarily eliminate all the risks, but they can definitely help you reduce the amount of time it takes to remediate a compromised host. Multi-factor authentication. It's no longer the next big thing. This is the solution that really moves the needle, and it's here now. And if you haven't today, I highly encourage everyone on the phone or listening to this webinar to look at turning MFA on for all remote access to your environment. That includes your email portals, your VPN, any of the cloud-based applications that support it. Please turn it on. This reduces the risk of your users reusing their passwords. It reduces the number of phone calls that your help desk is going to get because people forget their passwords, and it reduces the ability of an attacker to compromise your organization. And so really, this solution alone really moves the needle for folks. The next one is around patch management. And I've been talking about patch management since the late 90s when I first got into this industry. And I'll tell you, it's still one of the number one elements of security. Just this month, Microsoft released several dozen patches that resolve several remote compromised vulnerabilities. And so, again, if you're listening to this, if you haven't, I would talk to your IT folks to make sure that they've pushed those patches out that came out this past Tuesday. But remember, you still have customer sensitive information on every device in your environment, unless you're using a virtual desktop solution. And so patching really reduces the threat of any sort of malicious software impacting your daily operations, as well as compromising consumer data. And it's also important to note that Microsoft's not the only vendor out there that sends out patches. Oracle and Adobe, so again, Java and Acrobat and things of that nature, those third-party software suites also need patching. And while Equifax has been out of the news quite a bit lately, again because of the settlement, remember that their incident was caused because they didn't patch their systems. They had an ineffective patch management program in place, and that led to them paying out $700 million in a settlement just this year. Email security is another one we talked about earlier as well. Make sure that this is something free that you can do. These are controls that you just need to configure. Make sure you have DMARC and SPF records for all of your domains for your organization, not just your primary one, but many organizations have a number of vanity domains as well. Make sure all of those are properly configured and protected. Encryption. Encryption at rest and encryption in transit. It should always be at least AES 256. If you have wireless networks in your organization, make sure it's turned on with at least WPA2 encryption. And make sure that all your public-facing websites, even if they're just marketing sites, are using HTTPS now. Encryption for web servers is relatively inexpensive from an overhead perspective now, and the more that we can encrypt, the better we can protect ourselves. Ensure that your email platform uses opportunistic encryption so that emails are sent to and from your organization encrypted every single time they can be. Make sure your encryption for your device is on by default, and even your backups, make sure those are encrypted so that you're protecting that content when it's offline of your network. And then firewalls. I mean, this is part of that traditional security framework, but these are still important. Make sure that you're reviewing your firewalls at least quarterly. Make sure they're configured properly, that they're also getting patched. If you're not using a next generation device like a Palo Alto or a Cisco Meraki, I highly encourage you to look at those type of things. And start looking at turning on things like geotagging to limit who can access your network resource. Yes, from time to time people go on vacation to Mexico or overseas, but by and large, you probably don't need to open yourself up and your systems up to access from everywhere in the world. Look at the native tools that you have that come with the solutions that you've bought. So again, Microsoft and Amazon, they continue on a almost weekly basis add additional security features and tools to their platforms. Amazon has a platform called Trusted Advisor and Guard Duty. On the Microsoft side, they have things like their Active Threat Simulator and Advanced Threat Protection to help organizations test their IR and cybersecurity capabilities. And so with that, we've got a couple minutes left that I wanted to see if we had any questions to address. And with that, again, I'd like to thank everybody that attended. And if you didn't get a chance to ask a question and you'd like to, please feel free to submit them to us, and we'll address those questions with a direct follow-up. And as also a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the slide deck is going to be emailed out to all the participants in the next couple of days. And if you could also please take a minute to fill out the survey that's going to appear on your screen at the close of today's webinar, we would greatly appreciate it. And so with that, again, I appreciate everybody's time today. And hopefully, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you very much.